Back tonight on In Focus, as tributes continue to pour in for Human Rights Watch, Southern Africa Director Dewa Mavhinga, Human Rights Watch reported that it was saddened by his sudden death, describing him as a deeply empathetic and highly effective activist whose work made many people's lives better. For more on Mavhinga's legacy, we are joined now by African Parliamentarians Association for Human Rights Chairperson and founder, good evening and thank you very much for your time and coming through tonight here on In Focus. A man who is beloved by his colleagues, many who are in the human rights movement across the globe. What would be, first and foremost, your initial impressions of the news of his passing and I suppose your tribute message?
Dewa, firstly, I would like to take this opportunity to extend my deepest condolences on behalf of the Africa Network to Dewa Mavhinga and his family and all his colleagues around the African continent and the world. Indeed, Dewa was a fearless human rights activist. We worked very closely on a number of initiatives that we rolled out and implemented as the African Parliamentarians Association for Human Rights. In fact, my first encounter with Dewa was in 2018 when we had a strategic planning session of AfriPA in South Africa, in Cape Town. And we invited him because we wanted to undertake a fact-finding mission to the Democratic Republic of Congo, same year, I think it was in October. It was shortly before the elections that were going to be held in October there. And there were serious human rights violations that were taking place in the DRC at the time. Dewa and his colleagues from the Human Rights Watch shared information with us. They communicated with us on a regular basis as we were preparing to undertake what was at the time a very risky but important mission, because we were trying to highlight the human rights violations that were taking place in the DRC at the time. As Africa, we've also undertaken and been involved in a number of human rights initiatives in the African continent, where we were in regular contact, in particular myself as the chairperson of the network with Dewa. Even in 2019, I visited Harare, and there were a number of bilateral meetings between human rights organizations that were taking place there. I was able to have a discussion with him. We're planning to have quite a number of initiatives implemented in the SADC region. Then COVID hit. But I think there's a context that has actually given rise to the likes of Dewa Mavhinga and myself in Africa. I think a bit of historical background is a bit important in fairness, if I may. If we were to look at the African continent in its totality, we understand that in 1900, the first Pan-African conference took place in London. And it was sponsored by Sylvester Williams from Trinidad and Tobago, a lawyer who later came to South Africa to practice here. There were a number of others. I think the second one was in 1919 in Paris. And the most talked about is the 1945 Manchester Conference, where there was a positive action plan for the decolonization of Africa. Fast forward to 1963, when the OAU was established. And then in 1979 and 1980, as an example, when Dewa Mavhinga was born, there was the Monrovia Declaration in 1979. And there was also the Lagos Action Plan in 1980, right? And these plans were talking about developing and trying to actually lift Africa out of the malice of poverty and development, but also build an environment that respects and promotes human rights. Yeah. And then to also consolidate democracy in Africa and governance and good governance. If you were even to look at 1981, the Banjul Charter, the Charter on Human and People's Rights, which was adopted in 1981, and then only came into force in 1986, look at what happened then when the Charter was adopted and what has happened in Africa, a context where human rights violations become an order of the day. There is no respect for democracy. There is bad governance in Africa, but meaning Africa is not short of action plans. So despite all the action plans, the programs that have been adopted, the treaties, the declarations, we have not even made much progress. If you were to look at the Africa Agenda 2063, it contains much of what is contained in NEPAD, contains much of what is contained in the Lagos Action Plan, and it even talks about silencing guns in 2021 and building an environment of human rights. But none of that has happened. So it means that when we operate in a context where member states aren't committed to delivering and even implementing the declarations and the commitments that they make when they meet under the AU umbrella, Africa, the whole of Africa, not just the Southern Africa region,
Yeah.
needs more Dewa Mavhingas and more human rights activists to come out and be able to be the voice of the voiceless when it comes to human rights violations that take place around the continent.
Absolutely. I mean, I spoke to him last around the human rights violation that occurred during the COVID-19 lockdowns and the disbursements of the stimulus packages. I found him to be, at a personal level, a very kind a human being, except for the work and the brilliance in terms of being a lawyer and an eloquent speaker. How did you find him as a person at a personal interaction?
Brilliant, very. He had empathy. He loved fellow Africans. He was very committed to human rights in Africa. He actually made sure, he always wanted to make sure that we could collaborate on issues that had to do with raising human rights issues. I want to give an example about the DRC. And even when there were gross human rights violations that were taking place in Zimbabwe, he would call on other sister human rights organizations and people who were involved in the human rights space, the activists, to say, we need more voices. We need more voices to speak on this issue. I want to also tell you when we were accused of being xenophobic. When there was a flare-up of xenophobic violence in South Africa a couple of years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, Dewa said we need a South African voice to condemn what is happening, but a South African voice that understands the human rights space, that is not going to use what was happening in the country for petty political point scoring. And he made that call to me, and he was the first one in some instances where people saw it as an opportunity to actually to be in the limelight. He was the first one to condemn that and said we needed a more collaborative effort about how we address challenges that face South Africa. He, in a private conversation, even admitted that more needs to be done about the behavior, the unbecoming behavior of other member states in the African continent who are trying to create South Africa or turn South Africa into a labor bureau of the rest of the African continent. Said until and unless we address the human rights violations that take place in other countries and we're able to hold member states of other countries, member states at AU level, for gross human rights violations, for unbecoming conduct, you are not going to address the migration that takes place because people have no choice because of conditions that they find themselves in, which are becoming and appalling in their own home countries. So we needed a comprehensive strategy to deal with the challenges that face the African continent.
You speak of the impact of his work as an activist, but what would you say made him so highly effective as a human rights activist?
It's commitment. It's commitment and the willingness, obviously, to interact with people. Remember, when you're in the human rights space, people come to you randomly. You don't, you mustn't question their locus standi when people come to you and complain about a specific issue. Yours is to listen, and yours is to see what you can do about that issue. And whether or not you should be putting together a campaign to try and raise and create awareness about those challenges, but to also get all the different stakeholders that you could work with to try and address the problem. Because it's one thing to raise the issues, express concern, create awareness about the violations, but behind the scenes, you have to do the difficult work of lobbying the various stakeholders, talking to them, right? Trying to get them to come around the table and to discuss their differences and issues, which even as we're undertaking some of our missions to the rest of the African continent, that is the advice he gave. He said, yes, you can raise this issue sharply in the public domain and in the media so that people know about them, but you also have the responsibility to bring the wearing factions of the parties around the table so that they can discuss their issues and find. Because you see, when it comes to issues of human rights violations, you have to get the stakeholders to talk about those issues, to be the ones that develop a roadmap that would take them out of that quagmire.
He oversaw a broad range of issues in the region that have to do with the preservation of human rights, but also documented quite a lot about human rights violations within his own country. What would be the task for the civil society in Zimbabwe that they would need to pick up now where Dewa left off?
No, they have to pick up the spear. They have to continue the good work that Dewa Mavhinga did, especially in his home country, Zimbabwe. I mean, you must know that you're an excellent human rights activist if member states, especially in the African continent, where human rights violations at the end of the day, if they don't like you for some reason, they accuse you of being a sellout, or they accuse you of being an agent of some hidden agenda. You must know that you are asking the difficult questions, and that is what was happening with Dewa Mavhinga. because he'd be quick to raise issues, quick to condemn them, but at the same time, find collaborative ways of trying to address those issues. But he continued up until his last days to be the voice of the voiceless and to also associate himself with the oppressed and those whose human rights violations were violated on a daily basis. I think our colleagues from Zimbabwe, but our colleagues from the rest of the African continent have big shoes to fill. We have to work harder. We have to try to emulate his example. We have to pick up the spear and continue his good work.
Thank you very much, and for coming through and your tribute here tonight on In Focus.
Much obliged.
He's the chairperson and founder of the African Parliamentarians Association for Human Rights.